True crime is often reduced to a single shocking act. Yet the most disturbing cases rarely begin or end there. They develop over time, shaped by patterns of control, silence, and failure that quietly intensify beneath ordinary life. This collection looks beyond the crime scene to the long paths that lead to it, where trust masks danger and warning signs are overlooked. Across these stories, justice unfolds unevenly, verdicts change, responsibility shifts, and closure remains elusive. Rather than offering simple answers, these cases reveal how violence emerges from familiar spaces and how its consequences continue long after the moment of the crime itself. Dr. Michele Picard, State, New Hampshire, age 73 years old, released in 2015. Some crimes seize attention not through chaos or spectacle, but through the chilling calm with which they are carried out, and the case of Michele Picard stands as a stark example of violence executed in silence rather than rage. In 2005 in New Hampshire, a husband was shot and killed while he slept, a detail that immediately stripped the act of any claim to spontaneity and placed intent at the center of the narrative. There was no struggle, no warning, and no opportunity for defense, only a deliberate decision carried out in the most private of spaces. What followed was not a search for an unknown suspect, but a prolonged legal reckoning that would evolve over a decade and ignite fierce public debate. Michele Picard shot her husband while he slept in 2005, received a life sentence in 2006, saw that sentence reduced in 2009 due to procedural errors, and was conditionally released in 2015. Because she was never sentenced to death. There is no execution date, none was ever set. The absence of an execution date does not soften the crime. Instead, it sharpens the controversy surrounding punishment and proportionality. In 2006, the life sentence initially imposed reflected society's condemnation of a killing committed against a defenseless victim, suggesting finality and moral clarity. Yet in 2009, procedural flaws reopened the case, transforming a seemingly settled outcome into a legal fault line, where certainty fractured and trust in process became paramount. For true crime observers, the story shifted from the act itself to the system's response, how errors can alter destinies long after verdicts are rendered. By 2015, conditional release intensified scrutiny, with critics arguing that the quiet finality of killing a sleeping person demanded an equally final sanction, while others maintained that adherence to procedure is the bedrock of justice, even when outcomes are uncomfortable. There is no dramatic manhunt, no forensic riddle awaiting future science. The facts are stark, and it is precisely that starkness that lingers. The lack of an execution date, because death was never authorized as punishment, becomes symbolic of unresolved closure, a reminder that justice does not always arrive with a clean ending. For some, the outcome represents mercy tempered by law, for others it signifies imbalance, as if procedure eclipsed the gravity of a life taken in sleep. Long after the gunshot of 2005 faded and the gavel fell in 2006, the case continues to provoke debate, not because the crime is unclear, but because the resolution remains unsettling. In the end, Michele Picard's story endures as a warning that the most chilling crimes can be committed without noise or haste, and without an execution date to punctuate society's response, leaving behind consequences measured not in moments, but in years of controversy and unease. From quiet execution, the narrative turns to a case where justice itself slowly collapses. Dr. Barbara Steger, State, North Carolina, 77 years old, execution date unknown. Some cases are haunting not because of the level of violence, but because of how they expose the fragility of justice when errors accumulate over time. The Barbara Steger case is one such instance, a story not just about the death of a husband, but a decades-long journey where truth is obscured by flawed investigations, subjective speculation, and blind faith in initial conclusions. This wasn't a sensational case, but a silent tragedy where each stage of the proceedings pushed justice further away from its equilibrium. In 1988 in North Carolina, the husband was found shot dead in his own home. There were no clear signs of forced entry, no direct witnesses, but the pressure to find the perpetrator quickly locked the investigation in a single direction. The death was described as premeditated murder, and the story began to be told in a "whoever had the motive is the culprit" fashion. From then on, the case gradually shifted from the pursuit of truth to the consolidation of a pre-selected hypothesis. By 1991, a life sentence was handed down, giving the public the feeling that justice had been served. But that certainty was only superficial. Beneath the surface, insidious flaws emerged. Circumstantial evidence was exaggerated, scientific assumptions were misused, and details favorable to the accused were downplayed or ignored. For years afterward, the case was cited as a prime example of completed justice, even though it was rotten from within. From 1994 to 2010, a series of investigative irregularities were gradually exposed. The analytical methods were questioned, and the way evidence was collected and interpreted was shown to be biased, even biased. Each new discovery not only shook the verdict, but also forced the justice system to confront an unsettling question. Could a person be convicted not for the truth, but for the failure of the very process of protecting the truth? The culmination of this journey came in 2012, when the case was officially overturned and the verdict overturned. The acquittal was not dramatic, nor did it have the emotional climax of a movie. It unfolded quietly, but left a profound impact. A verdict once considered solid turned out to have been built on a foundation of error. Justice not only arrived late, it almost never arrived. Throughout that process, one thing never existed: the date of execution. Although sentenced to life imprisonment, Barbara Steger was never sentenced to death, so there was no, and never was, an execution date set. This absence becomes a symbolic detail in the story, not because of leniency, but because it underscores another reality: the system can wrongly imprison, but it can also avoid the most irreversible mistakes. The Barbara Steger case is often cited today as a classic example of the dangerous intersection between professional power and judicial failure. It shows that when initial assumptions become the sole guiding principle, all evidence can be bent to serve a chosen narrative. Ultimately, this is not just the story of a murder never fully solved, but a chilling warning about the price of careless investigation and blind faith in the system. There is no execution date to close this story. Only one lesson remains: that in criminology, the failure of justice is sometimes more haunting than the crime itself. As wrongful certainty unravels, the focus moves to violence born from prolonged fear and desperation. Dr. Kathi Aultman, State, Ohio, 75 years old, sentenced to life. The Kathi Aultman case is remembered not for the chaos of a single violent outburst, but for how a seemingly ordinary day crystallized into tragedy after years of accumulated tension. In 2001 in Ohio, the day of the crime did not begin with a violent argument or a public fight. According to records, the context was the result of a long-standing, violent marriage where fear and control had become the norm. It was precisely the outward calmness of that day that made the case most difficult to judge legally. On that fateful day, the gunshot that killed the husband ended a years-long conflict in just seconds. There were no signs of an ongoing attack at the time, and this detail quickly became the central focus of the entire case. For investigators, the question wasn't what happened, but under what circumstances it happened. Was it a survival reaction after a long period of abuse, or was it murder committed when the threat was no longer immediate? Following the shooting, the scene was sealed off, statements were collected, and the marital past was quickly scrutinized. The preceding years filled with threats, tension, and control were included in the record as mitigating circumstances, but not enough to convince the prosecution that it was legitimate self-defense under strict legal standards. The law requires the threat to be immediate and unavoidable at the moment of the use of deadly force, and on the day of the incident, that was not proven in a way the court would accept. By 2002, Kathi Aultman was convicted of murder and received a harsh sentence. This verdict reflected the justice system's firm stance. While domestic violence is an undeniable reality, firing a gun when the threat was not immediately apparent still constitutes a serious crime. The sentence marked a shift from a person living in fear to the status of a criminal, where every subsequent action was defined by the court's judgment. Aultman's imprisonment unfolded amidst ongoing controversy. Inside prison, time dragged on in slow, uneventful months, without a clear climax or conclusion. Outside, the case became a hot topic in academic and legal discourse, frequently cited in discussions about the line between self-defense and murder. Supporters argued that the sentence ignored the psychological reality of victims of prolonged violence, where the feeling of danger is not momentary but persistent. Conversely, defenders of the verdict stressed that the law cannot operate on subjective fear, otherwise the boundaries of the rule of law would be blurred. Throughout his imprisonment, one crucial detail was often misunderstood. There was no execution date. Kathi Aultman was not sentenced to death, and therefore no execution date was set. This absence did not diminish the severity of the sentence, but it demonstrated that the justice system distinguished this case from purely predatory or violent murders. The punishment was a long-term deprivation of liberty, not the end of a life. Over time, the sentencing process became a kind of double sentence. On the one hand, physical confinement; on the other, confinement in endless social controversy. Each year, the case is mentioned in literature, lectures, and true crime analyses as a classic example of the gray area of justice. The 2001 incident is no longer seen as a single event, but as the culmination of a series of failures to intervene early, to protect the victim, and to prevent the tragedy before it occurred. Ultimately, Kathi Aultman's story doesn't offer a complete and satisfying conclusion. It leaves an open question. If the law only looks at the final moment and ignores the entire process of prolonged violence, does justice truly reflect the whole truth? And as the day of the crime recedes, what remains is not the execution itself, but years of imprisonment and an ongoing debate. Beyond self-defense debates, the story deepens into manipulation, conspiracy, and delayed accountability. Dr. Maria Marshall, State, New Jersey, 83 years old, sentenced to 30 years. Some crimes reveal themselves immediately through violence and chaos. Others hide behind patience, calculation, and distance, unfolding over decades before the truth fully emerges. The case of Maria Marshall belongs to the latter category, a murder that initially appeared straightforward, only to evolve into one of New Jersey's most unsettling legal reversals, where the identity of the true architect remained obscured for years. The case began on September 7, 1984, when Maria Marshall's husband was found shot to death on the side of the Garden State Parkway in New Jersey. At first glance, the scene suggested a random roadside killing. The narrative was simple and compelling. A man stranded on the highway, confronted by unknown assailants, shot and left to die. Early investigators treated the case as an opportunistic crime by strangers, and public attention briefly moved on. That clarity did not last. As detectives dug deeper, inconsistencies surfaced: timing issues, financial motives, and unexplained contacts. The investigation pivoted sharply, and suspicion shifted inward. The husband himself became the focus of a theory, alleging that the killing had been staged as part of an insurance scheme gone wrong. This reframing dramatically altered the course of the case and would define the next decade of legal proceedings. By 1986, the husband was convicted and sentenced to death, a verdict that appeared to resolve the case decisively. The justice system had identified a villain, assigned punishment, and delivered what seemed to be closure. Maria Marshall, meanwhile, remained publicly positioned as a peripheral figure, grieving, composed, and legally untouched. For many observers, the story ended there. But the desire for finality collided with a deeper problem. The evidence did not withstand time. As appeals progressed, serious flaws in the prosecution's case were exposed. Witness reliability, prosecutorial conduct, and evidentiary handling came under scrutiny. In 1993, the death sentence was overturned, sending shockwaves through the legal community and reopening questions that had been prematurely settled. The collapse of the original conviction forced investigators to revisit assumptions they had once treated as facts. When they did, the case took an unexpected turn. The focus shifted again, this time toward Maria Marshall herself. Prosecutors began to argue that the murder was not a failed self-directed plot, but a coordinated conspiracy, orchestrated from behind the scenes rather than executed directly. According to this revised theory, the killing was arranged through intermediaries, motivated by financial gain and personal calculation. The crime, prosecutors argued, was never meant to involve the original suspect as the triggerman, but as a disposable piece in a larger plan. This reframing transformed the case from a tragic misjudgment into a long-canaled orchestration of murder. In 2006, more than 20 years after the shooting, Maria Marshall entered a guilty plea to charges related to conspiracy in the murder of her husband. The plea acknowledged her role without requiring a full retrial, closing a legal saga that had consumed decades of court resources and public attention. She was sentenced to 30 years in prison, a punishment reflecting both the severity of the crime and the complexity of the case's procedural history. There was no execution date, because Maria Marshall was never sentenced to death. The absence of capital punishment in her case stands in stark contrast to the original death sentence imposed on her husband years earlier, a reversal that underscores how dramatically the narrative had shifted. Justice, in this instance, did not arrive swiftly or cleanly. It arrived slowly, unevenly, and with lasting ambiguity. The Maria Marshall case endures in true crime analysis not because of graphic violence, but because of what it reveals about the justice system itself. It demonstrates how early assumptions can harden into convictions, how narratives can mislead investigators, and how proximity to a crime does not always equate to control over it or immunity from it. The case also illustrates a more uncomfortable truth. Some crimes are designed to be invisible, relying on others to carry out the final act, while the mastermind remains distant. Today, the case is frequently cited as a cautionary example of legal tunnel vision and delayed accountability. It raises difficult questions about culpability, manipulation, and the moral weight of indirect violence. There is no single moment of closure, no definitive ending that satisfies all observers. Instead, the case leaves behind a lingering discomfort, a reminder that justice can be delayed not only by error, but by deception crafted carefully enough to survive for years. In the end, Maria Marshall's story is not just about a murder in 1984. It is about how truth can fracture, reassemble, and finally surface long after the damage is done. It stands as a warning that some of the most dangerous crimes are not committed in anger or desperation, but in silence, planning, and patience, waiting for the system to look the other way. From hidden orchestration, attention shifts to escalation inside the home, ending in fatal judgment. Dr. Stephanie Russell, State, Kentucky, 54 years old, sentenced to 10 years. Before 2022, Dr. Stephanie Russell lived a life that aligned perfectly with public trust. She was a practicing pediatrician in Kentucky, first working in Owensboro before later relocating her medical career to Louisville. Behind that stable exterior, Russell's personal life was unraveling. Her marriage deteriorated into a bitter and prolonged divorce, marked not by quiet separation but by relentless conflict. Custody of the children became a battleground. Financial disputes escalated. Control over money, over time, over post-divorce life became the central issue. What began as a legal process gradually transformed into something far more corrosive. The relationship between Russell and her former husband shifted from structured legal disagreement into personal hostility. By early 2022, a critical line had been crossed. Stephanie Russell did not act in a sudden rage or emotional collapse. Instead, evidence later showed the formation of intent, quiet, deliberate, and calculated. She began exploring ways to permanently remove her ex-husband from her life. This was not impulsive behavior. There were no frantic phone calls or explosive confrontations. What emerged instead was planning. Intent preceded action, a defining marker of premeditated crime. At this stage, the case shifted from domestic conflict to criminal conspiracy. That conspiracy unfolded in the shadows of the internet. In 2022, Russell accessed the dark web in search of a hired killer. She communicated with someone she believed to be a professional hitman, unaware that she was in fact speaking to an undercover federal agent. During these exchanges, she provided specific details, names, addresses, daily routines, and agreed to pay using Bitcoin, a digital currency designed to obscure identity and financial trails. The conversations were precise and unemotional. There was no hesitation, no moral conflict expressed. The weapon was not a gun or a knife, but connectivity, encryption, and intent. Violence no longer required physical proximity, only resolve and access to Wi-Fi. Federal investigators were already watching. Midway through 2022, the FBI intervened, monitoring communications and documenting every step of the plan. Undercover agents gathered evidence of Russell's intent to kill, her willingness to pay, and her direct instructions. The operation prevented a homicide before it occurred, but the danger was real. Had law enforcement not stepped in, the outcome could have been irreversible. This was not a hypothetical threat, it was a plan nearing execution. By the end of 2022, Dr. Stephanie Russell was arrested and charged with federal crimes, including conspiracy to commit murder and interstate stalking. She faced long-term imprisonment, not because someone had died, but because the law recognizes that preparation and intent can be just as lethal as action. While awaiting trial in 2023, prosecutors alleged that Russell continued to explore ways to pursue her objective even while incarcerated, an indication that arrest had not extinguished the mindset behind the crime. In 2024, Russell pleaded guilty. A federal court sentenced her to 12 years in prison, 10 years for conspiracy to commit murder, and 2 years for interstate stalking. Her medical career ended completely. Today, she remains in federal custody, her former role as a pediatrician permanently eclipsed by the case that redefined her public identity. The Stephanie Russell case is not a story of emotional explosion. It is a study in calculation. It illustrates how intelligence, education, and access to technology can be weaponized when detached from ethical restraint. And it leaves a haunting question behind. When knowledge and authority lose their moral anchor, what truly stops a trusted professional from becoming a threat? Dr. Nancy Brophy, State, Oregon, 75 years old, sentenced to life. Some murder cases seem entirely fictional, so perfectly coincidentally ironic that they capture attention long before the full evidence is presented. The Nancy Brophy case is one such story. It garnered global attention not only because of the murder itself, but also because of a single, unsettling detail that refused to fade years before her husband was killed. She had written an essay titled, "How to Kill My Husband." What initially seemed like a bizarre coincidence later became one of the most disturbing details in modern criminal history. The case began on June 2, 2018 in Portland, Oregon. Early that morning, a chef was found shot dead inside the Oregon Culinary Academy, where he worked. The crime scene was quiet, controlled, and showed no signs of a struggle. 2 gunshot wounds, one to the back. One fatal led investigators to a premeditated murder rather than a failed robbery. From the outset, the method of the crime showed planning, timing, and familiarity with the victim's routine. Attention quickly shifted to the victim herself. Surveillance camera footage showed a vehicle matching Nancy Brophy's car near the Research Institute around the time of the murder. Financial pressure, life insurance policies, and a strained marriage were revealed as part of the context. While none of these elements alone proved guilt, they combined to form a pattern investigators could not ignore. As the case progressed, prosecutors built their hypothesis on prior preparation. They argued that the murder stemmed from financial desperation and was carried out with calculated intent. The prosecution emphasized the carefully calculated timing of the attack, the absence of witnesses, and the steps taken to avoid immediate detection. The key element of the story was Brophy's handwriting, not as direct evidence of guilt, but as context highlighting familiarity with deadly planning and narrative style. The defense countered with arguments of coincidence, other suspects, and the notion that fictional writing should not be confused with real-world intent. They stressed the lack of direct forensic evidence linking Brophy to the weapon and challenged the interpretation of indirect details. But the jury was required to consider not just any single piece of evidence, but the entire story that the events told. In 2022, following a widely publicized trial, Nancy Brophy was convicted of second-degree murder. The verdict reflected the jury's conclusion that the murder was premeditated and planned, even without any direct witnesses providing the weapon. She was sentenced to life imprisonment, a punishment that closed the legal chapter, but did not dampen public reaction. The case spread worldwide, becoming a frequent topic in real-life crime discussions and media analysis. It was cited as an example of how story, motive, and behavior can intertwine in ways that appear almost orchestrated yet deliver real, irreversible consequences. There was no ambiguity in the sentencing. The life sentence ensured that the punishment was proportionate to the severity of the crime. Today, the Nancy Brophy case persists more than just as a news headline. It is often used as a cautionary tale about how a vivid imagination, financial pressure, and personal resentment can converge into deadly acts. Ultimately, the most disturbing aspect of the case is not the essay title that made it famous, but the reality that followed. What began with words on a page ended with a life lost, another person imprisoned forever, and a story that continues to unsettle precisely because it reminds us that sometimes the most unbelievable crimes are the ones secretly planned from the outset. Finally, these cases converge into a haunting pattern of trust betrayed and consequences without closure. Dr. Clara Harris, State, Texas, 68 years old, sentenced to 20 years. Before 2002, Dr. Clara Harris was a practicing dentist in Houston, Texas, operating a successful clinic alongside her husband, Dr. David Harris, who shared both her profession and her business. In early 2002, Clara Harris started to suspect that her husband was having an affair. At first, it was intuition, small behavioral changes, unexplained absences. the kind of subtle inconsistencies that rarely stand on their own as proof. But suspicion alone was not enough for someone like Clara. Rather than confronting David directly, she chose verification. She hired a private investigator. This decision marked a critical psychological shift. Doubt gave way to surveillance, and uncertainty turned into confirmation. The investigator produced concrete evidence of David's extramarital relationship. At that moment, the betrayal was no longer hypothetical. It was documented, time-stamped, and undeniable. When suspicion becomes fact, emotional containment collapses. The mind stops negotiating with possibility and begins reacting to reality. In July 2002, that reality reached its breaking point. Clara discovered that David was staying at a hotel with his mistress. Instead of retreating or delaying, she drove to the location herself. What followed was not a private confrontation, but a public reckoning. The argument that unfolded was intense, emotionally charged, and humiliating, taking place not behind closed doors, but in a space where Clara was forced to confront both infidelity and the collapse of her perceived identity. What happened next transformed a domestic crisis into a homicide case that would echo across American true crime history. In the hotel parking lot, Clara entered her Mercedes. David Harris was outside the vehicle. She drove forward and struck him. Then she reversed. Then she drove forward again, multiple times. Each impact reduced the plausibility of accident and increased the weight of intent. Surveillance cameras captured the entire sequence, eliminating ambiguity. David Harris died at the scene from catastrophic injuries. This was not a single impulsive motion. It was a repeated action with pauses in between, enough time, prosecutors would later argue, for reflection, reconsideration, and restraint. Clara Harris was arrested shortly after the incident and charged with murder under Texas law. Her defense team framed the case as a crime of passion, arguing that she had acted under extreme emotional disturbance triggered by sudden discovery of infidelity. It was a strategy rooted in empathy, appealing to jurors' understanding of betrayal and rage, but the prosecution focused relentlessly on the video evidence. They argued that passion might explain an initial strike, but it could not justify repetition. The law, they emphasized, does not punish feelings, it punishes actions. In 2003, a Texas court rejected the crime of passion argument. The jury found Clara Harris guilty of murder. She was sentenced to 20 years in prison and fined $10,000. The ruling underscored a central principle of criminal law's: emotional pain does not erase accountability, especially when conduct demonstrates deliberation beyond a single moment. The verdict sent a clear message that professional status and personal anguish do not place a defendant above legal consequence. And that leaves the question that still divides audiences: was this an irreversible emotional tragedy or a conscious act of violence that demanded full accountability? Where, exactly, should justice draw the line? The lesson behind these cases is both simple and unsettling. Extreme violence is rarely sudden, and it is rarely invisible in hindsight. Warning signs are present, but too often ignored, minimized, or normalized. When systems fail to intervene early, whether legal, medical, or social, the cost becomes irreversible. Justice may punish after the fact, but it cannot restore what was lost. These stories remind us that prevention, accountability, and attention matter long before a crime reaches its final moment.